Hi, I'm Dr. Amy Robbins, and welcome to Life, Death, and the Space Between. I love when I find a kindred spirit, and there's so many people on the show that I've loved interviewing, but today's episode with Lisa Keefauver, hopefully I got the pronunciation right. I practiced many times before saying this, was just a beautiful interview for me. I think we both come from similar backgrounds in the mental health space, but Lisa is an in-demand grief activist, speaker, and author, and her book, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, which I love the title of. She's got a cheeky way of talking about grief that really makes it palpable and applicable in your life, and really simple tips that you can use to help move you in your grief. We talked a lot about how grief shows up in so many different ways in so many different places in our lives. It's not just about the death of a loved one, but it can be many different ways and places. And her mantra in terms of what you can do every day, not just when you're grieving, but also when you're living. So make sure you stay tuned till the end to hear her and my big tip about, which we decided could be a whole other podcast, frankly, about how to live now and what you can apply to your everyday life. Welcome, Lisa, to Life, Death, and the Space Between.
It's such a pleasure to be here. And as I was saying before, it's a special pleasure to be on the other side of the microphone for a change.
The other side. The double.
Yeah, being a guest.
The double entendre. Is that what that is?
Yeah.
The other side. Stuff I always love talking about.
Exactly.
So your book, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, what a great cheeky title. And you and I talked a little bit before how I really appreciate, everybody knows who listens to the podcast, I read all the books. I appreciate this sort of, it's not a tongue-in-cheek take, but it's a little bit lighter in that you're really talking about grief in a very real, genuine, cheeky kind of way. What led to that? I mean, you've experienced a lot of loss. You've had a lot of trials and tribulations, including recently. Can you tell my listeners kind of what your experience was and how you ended up in this cheeky space with your relationship with grief?
Yeah. Well, thanks again for having me on the show. And it's always a funny story. I think any of us who are older than 20 to think about the through line of our lives, like how do we connect through all of those things. I consider myself a grief activist, which definitely was not a title that I, aspired to when I was a young girl. I don't think anybody
sign
does.
Me up for that.
Sign me up.
Right.
Ooh, so great, right? Astronaut, president, grief activist, But really along the way, what I recognize is it's really been the intersection, which I think is the case for so many of us, at the personal and professional intersections of grief and loss in my life. I've had a sustained meditation on bearing witness and holding space that came from an early childhood trauma, which is what led me to getting a master's in social work. And so I spent much of my career working in foster care and adoption and family services, crisis intervention, which meant I was working with humans, which meant I was working with grief. But it wasn't until I was 40 and in bed with my husband as he died in my arms from a long misdiagnosed brain tumor and had to return back to work less than 2 weeks later, that I started to recognize the ways in which our culture sort of writ large, but even our helping community, my fellow social workers, my psychologists, all the folks in the helping space really had such a narrow and misguided and limited story of grief, and that was causing so much unnecessary suffering for all of us who were going through it. And it meant too that I started to recognize the ways in which we clinicians in a way can inadvertently pathologize very normal, real, natural responses to loss. And so, I sort of worked in different spaces, went on to found a cancer nonprofit with a young woman and did some work in that space, which meant I started to become a public speaker, getting on media and TV, because that's what you have to do when you're got to have a startup nonprofit. and continued to be a writer. My training was in narrative therapy. So the power of story, how we talk about things, is really profound. And during that time, I faced another loss, was with my friend Joe, and he passed away. And
who was a huge supporter of you.
Who was a huge supporter of me.
You talk about in the book. Like he was the person who really knew intuitively how to be with you as you were grieving.
He really did, which is so funny, because if you all ever had the privilege of meeting Joe, you would not look at Joe and think like, this guy gets it. You know, he was tattooed from neck to toe, and, you know, just was like the most irreverent, I'm covered in tattoos too, so I'm not judging, but it was just the most irreverent person anyhow. But again, I returned to work. I was working with families who had family members going through cancer. And I just became more and more frustrated with sort of the cultural illiteracy, as I call it, or grief illiteracy that we had, and the ways in which that was making the already difficult but normal response to loss, which comes from all kinds of things, not just death, even more complicated. Mm-hmm. And another sort of different issue with my health that turned out to be nothing too serious at the time sort of gave me a wake-up call in 2019. Like, I can't have had all this professional and personal experience with loss, can't have all this speaking, writing, like, you know, all the work that I have done, and not use it for something. In part too, because, by the way, I had become the person that everybody sent their grieving friend to. You know what I mean? I had become that person, like, oh, go talk to Lisa. She knows how to hold space and bear witness for this. And so 2019, so remember, this is pre-pandemic, I decided that I'm going to create a company around grief. And that included the podcast, that included speaking, that included writing, some of which have like evolved over time. But to sort of tie it together about how did I show up writing a book that, well, this is the same title as my podcast, which I founded in 2019, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, and is still about to launch season 6. But the way the book is written, I like to think about as your wise best friend guiding you through this thing. So there's real heart, and there's metaphor, and there's narrative, but there's also some cheekiness. And as one reviewer called it, a judicious use of swearing, which I appreciated that particular. I said, yeah, that's about right. Because all the things, right? Because grief is hard, and it makes you want to swear, and the way people do and don't show up for you makes you want to cuss. And it also, you need humor and metaphor and all of these things as a balm to the weight of grief, right? Because it is also absurd too. So like, how can you not make a joke? I'm not making a joke at the expense of people. I'm sort of cracking wise and using humor as a way to sort of say, I see you, I know you, I understand how absurd and peculiar and ridiculous this entire journey is.
Right. I mean, I remember people who've been listening to me for a long time will know this story, but I have a very dear friend who lost her husband as well to a brain tumor. And we were talking one day, and I said to her, so do you think we could pull the dead husband card on this one? And she's like, totally. And it was like such like a great, I mean, I knew I could say that with her because we had that relationship, but it was like such a great way to say, like, let's just call this what it is. Like, it sucks.
Yes.
And you're 40, I think she was like 44 at the time, and you have a dead husband. Like, that's insane. Yeah. It's wrong.
Exactly.
It's backwards. It's effed up.
Exactly. So to use, I mean, a little bit of cursing, as I said, is in the book. A little bit of humor is in the book. A lot of metaphor and poetry, because I really believe in the power of that. And I say that there was a lot of intentionality around that, but also that's just who I am. Mm-hmm. So when I sat down to take on this momentous task of writing a book, I thought there's plenty of other people, because like you, I read all the books, particularly in the grief space. So there's lots of great work out there in the canon. So I don't need to go out there and be, Nora McInerney. I'm not going to go out there and be Megan Devine. I'm going to go out there and be me and use all the tools and life experiences, professional experiences, which include my sense of humor, which includes my penchant for a cuss word here and there, which includes my penchant for metaphor, and put that in this book and structure it in such a way that people can drop in and find exactly what they need in any given moment. And so, I mean, there was intentionality around it, but also I can't imagine having written a different book, because this book is
An expression
very
of
much
you.
my voice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to get back to this notion of narrative therapy. So for people who don't know what that is, can you explain a little bit about what that is, and how you incorporate that? You talk about this grief belief. Can you talk about how you weave that through and what you see in terms of people's grief stories around their grief belief?
Yeah, no, I love this question. So narrative therapy is a form of therapy. And for those who are in the medical community listening, the narrative medicine is sort of a growing field of interest. It happened to be what I was studying back in the 20 something years ago when I was in graduate school. But it really resonated for me, which is really that our life is full of all kinds of experiences. And the meaning we make is really based on the stories that we tell of the incidents that we collect together to form a narrative. And so we should always be a little curious, maybe even a little suspect when we feel some stuck kind of way or some way in which we're suffering, because there's perhaps another way to string together other life experiences, other perspectives to create a narrative or a story that's more of service to us. One metaphor I like to use is our life experiences is like all the stars in the sky. And over time, we begin because culture tells us stories about ourselves, or we tell stories about ourselves. And then when we look in the night sky, all we can see is the Little Dipper or Orion's belt, because we've plucked those same stars together and we can trace that story. And so then that becomes the truth with a capital T of our life. Mm-hmm. In grief, that can look like grief beliefs that we hold because we've heard from culture, from ourselves, from our parents. That's the orienting question I ask at the beginning of every episode. What's your earliest memory of grief and how did your family talk about it? Mm-hmm. And so that story might include, you're not allowed to grieve non-death losses. You shouldn't cry in public. You need to move on and get over it. It might include a lot of words that include should and shouldn't, right? And so then that's all you see, and you judge yourself against those sets of beliefs. Mm-hmm. But back to that metaphor, we might also look up in the starry night sky and see all the different experiences that were positive experiences or ways in which we were resilient. And then we can look to the night sky and start to draw those stories. And this is where I lose all of my, I don't have any astronomy skills here, but then we can draw the Big Dipper or other constellations.
But you can get the night sky app, my favorite app in the world.
Okay, that's exactly.
And look up what constellations there are.
Exactly. But really that perspective is, and the same goes outside of grief. So when people used to come to see me when I was a traditional therapist and they had the story of themselves as dumb or, anxious or
not lovable,
whatever that stuck story was, we would do a lot of excavating to say, well, what are the exceptions to those stories? How might we again look up in the night sky and see the time where you were smart or you were lovable or this thing happened or people had that reflection of you? Because the truth is the stories we tell limit what we see. So that we tell those stories over and over again, they become truth with a capital T. And then we become stuck and sort of a prisoner to that story. And we don't see another way of being. And so much of ways we struggle and suffer in life, but definitely in grief, often include because we are stuck in this narrative that keeps us limited and keeps us in a sort of self-critical instead of self-compassionate place, right, that see us limited in our perspective of how we move forward. And so I really intertwined. I mean, I do this throughout my work as a podcaster. I work with individuals one-on-one. When I speak from the stage, when I work with organizations, this narrative lens is always there. It's sort of how I see the world. And I intertwined it all the way through the book. That shows up in the grief beliefs, that shows up in my invitation to be a should detective, and in lots of other ways. Yeah.
Well, and what you're talking about is the road that gets paved, right? We pave that road in our mind over and over and over again, and it becomes so deep that we feel
and
like
it becomes true,
right?
That's that true with a capital T. But it's
because if you're going the same route every time you go somewhere, it's almost like, is there any other way to get there?
Exactly. And the thing that I think I'd like to remind people of, which hopefully it does not make people feel despairing, but hopeful, is that everything is a story. Mm-hmm. It's all a story. Our lives are a story. So Is the current story that you're telling serving you? Maybe it served you in the past and it's not now in the season of your grief, for example. And can you be curious and self-examining to see if there's a different story that might give you more agency or capacity or a way forward? because it's all just made up. Like we only pluck so many experiences from our lives to form these talking points that we have about ourselves in the world. Yeah.
What are your thoughts about, you mentioned this a little bit earlier, I think certainly in the mental health space, right? We see so much of grief just around death. And maybe we're starting to talk a little bit more about it around other things, but I find in my practice that almost everything comes back to some sort of loss. Like every presenting problem, if you pull the thread long enough, it brings you back to either some sort of loss or fear of death. those two things. Usually the loss leads to a fear of death because you realize like we are not.
It's all impermanent,
right.
And 100%, as my favorite party opening line is, 100% of us are going to die.
Right.
Hi, my name's Lisa.
Right.
Let's
right.
talk.
And there's two things that are for sure, right? Death and taxes. But I'm finding certainly as I'm moving into my middle age, like how much, particularly the women I work with, are talking about issues that are coming up for them, whether it's depression, anxiety. And again, when we start to dig a little deeper, it's like, well, what are your friendships looking like? What's going on with your kids? As these things start to shift and change, your job, right? Like if you're moving in a career in your midlife and maybe you're shifting to a different role or you're shifting out of a career, like the identities that are tied up in this and how much grief there is around those that I think does not get enough attention.
Yes. I mean, I'm just over here nodding for those of you who are watching, on video. I 100% agree with that. And that's part of what I had that sort of wake up moment when I went back to work as clinical director after Eric died. I was like, wait, we are pathologizing and naming, not that, by the way, depression on its own right isn't a valid diagnosis sometimes or useful, or anxiety, et cetera. And yet I think there was such recognition, the ways in which across the board, and this was especially true in 2011. I do think it's getting better. I'm seeing more and more conversations, more and more trainings that include a more expansive way of thinking about grief, which is what I do. But I think when we really start to unpack it, we think like, of course you're anxious, you're a rock, you're ride or die, your person who you live with, who you counted on for your financial stability and your emotional well-being is now dead, or maybe they have dementia, or maybe they have Parkinson's, or they're not dead yet, but they're not them anymore. And so then you're not yourself anymore. And if we can start to normalize or acknowledge or give permission for people to be in the messiness of it all, then that might be a more useful road there. And to your point, I think so much gets threaded back to people not being given permission or not claiming permission or given the space or living in this grief illiterate culture to grieve those past losses, whether they were death losses in childhood, whether they were identity losses, whether they were catastrophic illnesses or injuries that limited a future dream of, performance as an athlete. There's so many, so it may not even be the current set of circumstances. It could be all of these former losses that we have to come to grips with because we have to recalibrate the story of our lives that includes the chapter of those losses. And instead, when we sort of push them away or deny them, we're just kind of like swimming, paddling, trying to catch ourselves up, but we haven't really incorporated those losses. So, I'm out here screaming from the rooftops, including my TEDx talk, which was called Why Knowing More About Grief Can Make It Suck Less, because I really do think so. I'm out here saying the more we can know about it, the more we can incorporate and metabolize it. And that gives us that capacity to be present to the what is of this current season of our lives. So, I think we have a long way to go in the medical community in particular, but I think also in the helping professions as well. But I am now part of a growing collaborative of grief leaders in the space. And, and I do feel some hope that we're shifting the conversation. But my book in particular and the work that I do is really, to your point, around expanding our understanding that grief is not just about death loss. And actually, the more we can practice attending to those other losses of identity, losses of dream, losses of future, the losses that come with trauma that we experience, the better able we're going to be able to have the skills and the resiliency to confront those death losses when they come, because
Right.
they
We've
will
built the
come.
muscle practicing that.
Exactly.
Each of these little hurdles is a little, it's like a inoculation against what is the grand, grief.
Absolutely. And by the way, just like I say, it's to suck
say.
less. It's to suck less.
Right.
Like, just grieving one loss doesn't make you like the next time around, you're just an iron shield. But you now, as you said, you have the musculature, you have the practices, you've learned a little bit how to allow emotions to move through you, because you've learned that they actually all are impermanent. And the more we resist, the more they stick and the more they hurt. So you have a musculature that allows you to navigate.
You don't
in a different
resist
way.
it as much. I mean, that was the thing my therapist said to me years ago about building emotional muscle that like just stuck with me and resonated with me so profoundly at the time, and has still, 15 years later, is still one of the things I use a lot in my practice, because I think it really helps people think about what you're doing when you're confronting these experiences and allowing the humanity of the feelings to come through, is that you're building muscle. And people, kids were like trying to teach this in schools, right? It's like social emotional learning and how to express your feelings and all of these things. And I think it's so important to recognize that that is the process anytime we experience a loss, that we're just building muscle and working through it. And then doesn't mean the next time it doesn't hurt and you're not sore from it, but oh, okay, I know that this ebbs and flows.
I know I'm capable of this.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And emotions, I often want to remind people, all of them. I hate the label good and bad. I don't believe in good and bad emotions. I think emotions are information. They're not facts. And so if we can approach being curious to our emotions, then we can learn something that might teach us about how we might navigate this particular season, of our lives. And unfortunately, we try to choose them a la carte. We were like, I would just like to have the joy and and pass on the sorrow today. Thank you, waiter. And we really can't, right? We have to allow them all. And the thing I remind folks all the time, if you're listening and you're in a season of deep grief, is to remember that no emotion, none, has ever lasted. Not a single one, including the ones you wish. Think of the last time you were, overflowing with joy. That didn't last. The last time you were deep, deep in anger or sorrow or longing, that didn't last either. And so if we can have a little bit of a looser grip, I don't know. I grew up in Michigan. So if you learn how to ski with a tow rope and you had to like hold on just so to get that right. I always think of that like metaphor of like,
either if you tears the skin off your hand.
It's either tears the skin or you don't go anywhere. Right. So just like to have a loose, sorry for you non-Midwest skiers, but just to have sort of a loose, curious, self-compassionate grip to our emotions and watch them go. It doesn't mean it's not going to hurt like hell. And there are some emotions we want to have more often of than others. That is for sure.
And if you're sticking with the tow rope metaphor, some you feel like you got run over by, right? Like you're the one that like was face
fall down flat.
Like people run you down.
Exactly. And so the more reason then to treat it though as of that recognition that it will come and go, because part of what's tricky about the more difficult emotions, and that's how I like to think about them as far as good and bad, more like easy or difficult, is the difficult emotions like anger or deep sorrow or sadness or regret or guilt or whatever, is they have this sort of tricky capacity to trick you into thinking you've always felt this way and you're always going to feel this way. They kind of have a tricky permanence to their essence. And so to always come back to all of them pass, and all I can do is be witness to it in a caring way and learn from it, is such an important reminder, especially when we're in the depths of some of those difficult emotions. This too shall pass, I think is a really important way to think about that. Yeah.
So you have what seems like your own kind of stages of grief in this book. I don't know if you'd call them that specifically, but can you talk a little about closing in, the messy middle, too much too soon, like those stages and how you define them?
Yeah. I don't think I would use stages per se. I think only because, as I said, culturally, I think we all got hooked on misinformed to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, 5 stages of coming to grips with your own death.
Right.
It was not actually 5 stages of grief, right? I'm sure your listeners know that. And so I think I have a little bubbly resistance to sort of the stages. But the thing that I do offer in the book is the recognition that we do move from kind of that, our bodies do this beautiful thing about putting us into shock. Right. And so there's that early season where we are sort of raging and yet numb at all at the same time. And that there's some point along the continuum, which looks different for everybody, where you maybe start to have some days of, it might not be joy, but you might have some days of ease, but then you have that deep sorrow. And then that's a kind of confusing, messy middle, because you're not in that early place of shock and numbness and terrified, but you're not somewhere down the road. Right. And then there's a place that you come to. And by the way, sometimes you kind of ebb and flow. And especially as new losses come, you might ebb and flow. So you have that early starting close in phase. You kind of have that maybe messy middle place. And then there might be a place someday down the road, which could be a year for you or 5 years from you, where you might be asking, wait, am I still grieving? Because maybe you're having more days than not that your grief isn't present as much, but maybe on the anniversaries, maybe on momentous occasions, maybe on the holidays, right?
And maybe you just see something that catches your eye.
And maybe, by the way, you see
reminds
something, you
right?
smell something. I mean, grief triggers can
Grief
show
is
up.
a sneaky bitch.
Grief's a sneaky bitch. But to that point, it's just a reminder as a framing so that whoever you are and wherever you are in your grief, when you pick up this book, I really wanted people to feel seen and acknowledged that they're in a place that is a place that everybody arrives at, not in some linear 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, but there's just like grief happens to all of us. We all kind of move generally through these seasons, as maybe a different way to think about it. And the season that I think is a particularly important part that I'd like to talk about a lot when I have the chance is that sort of early season, which is, and with that explanation or the invitation to start close in, which I took from one of my favorite poets, David White, who has a beautiful poem called Start Close In. But the reminder is really in these early seasons of grief, as we might call it, the overwhelm can be profound because we're in this learning phase of learning to live a life in the wake of whatever this loss is, death or some other kind of loss. Could be something more ambiguous, like a diagnosis of some kind. And the overwhelm can be so tremendous because we think we have to figure out the one right thing to do to get to there, wherever that far off horizon time is, I call that.
To not
right?
feeling
Horizon
this,
time.
right?
I don't want to feel this. And I want to figure out what I need to do and all the steps I need to do. And that's where we get stuck in that cultural BS about that there's some one right way to. And I don't want to be here. And so I'm looking at horizon time, both in a positive way, by the way. And I've also had a lot of clients in negative ways. So that horizon time might be, I just want to be at a place where I don't feel so much pain. That's that far off horizon time. But I also have clients who've said to me, and I've certainly experienced this myself, I don't want to be in a horizon time when I'm in a time where I'm not in pain, because that means I'm far away from my person, right? And so I think there's the both and, which happens, which I write about so much through the book. And it's really part of my message, is to help us get more comfortable with the messy, the both and of life.
The in-between, as I call it.
As you say, in the in-between, the beautiful in-between. And so the start close in invitation, which can happen to us in any season, but any season of overwhelm, which often happens in that early season of grief, is to sort of cast your gaze, take it away from that horizon time and cast your gaze, allow the mindfulness way of thinking about things, to the floor in front of you, and to start close in. What is the next best thing I can do, right? It's not the right thing or the big thing. The next best thing you can do, by the way, is sometimes the not doing. Sometimes the next best thing you can do is say no to a volunteer opportunity, say no to a dinner party. It could be taking a rest, taking a nap. Sometimes starting close in it's really about bringing mindful awareness to your present experience, kind of doing a body scan meditation, just doing a kind of present meditation, and saying, what's that next best thing? I can't tackle the estate planning today, but maybe what I can do is send one email to one lead on an estate planner to help me figure this out. And maybe that's enough. And to just have a lot of grace and to start close in. So that's how I think about those, really maybe in a way more of seasons, so that you might orient yourself. But I think the tools that we talk about in each of them kind of apply. I mean, I'm still practicing this in the wake of my grief of my husband, who I just passed the 13, which is bonkers to me, the 13-year anniversary of his death this month, you know? Yeah.
Right. And so I think that too, that there's that huge shift that grief is this ongoing process. It does not, to your point earlier, like the belief was that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages were for those who were left behind. They weren't, and that you were going to move through them. And when you got to the end, you know, you got your medal, you finished the race, and congratulations. But to your point, and to many who have spoken on this podcast before, it is ongoing, and it is always living beside you in some way, living within you. But it doesn't need to be the thing that takes hold.
Yeah. One of the metaphors I like to use, because again, I love me a metaphor, which is in the beginning, grief is your whole story, right? And it's not that grief shrinks. You just begin to live a life around it. And so eventually grief becomes a chapter in your story. It's not your whole story, although I know it feels that way in the beginning. And even that idea can feel scary to some people. I don't want it to not be my whole story. But that's one way to think about it, because that old myth of sort of, even if you went back way to Freud, who was like, cut it off and move on, right? And you know, that was how you had a healthy way of thinking about life, is that when you think about it becoming a chapter, or maybe many chapters, depending on the loss you experience, as a part of your whole story, it means we get to carry our person, or that version of us in the before, with us. We don't have to leave them behind. Again, it's not an either or, it's a both and. It's a part of, just like when you read a fiction, you wouldn't read chapter 1, then read chapter 2, and then rip out chapter 1, and like nothing that happened in chapter 1 is relevant to this story, right? Of course, it's always going to be there, but now you're meeting new characters, you're learning new things. The protagonist has new skills. They have new challenges. You thought
the person in chapter 1 is not the person you thought they were.
Exactly. And that's so to take that sort of good, bad, or that sort of binary of before and after, I think, and to think about that both the life that you had with that person also gets to live on if it's a death loss. That's the nice thing about it, right? As does the acute grief that we feel early on. But that gets to be part of the story that shapes you. And you get to decide in some ways how much a part of that is part of your story, how much you bring it forward. Do you want to share the memories of your person, et cetera? But that's one way to think about it. And I think it's more reflective of actually how we navigate grief, which is really important, because back to your point earlier about sort of the helping community not really understanding grief and then sort of missing the mark, is it's really harmful when we hear a story of grief that doesn't match our lived experience of grief. Because inevitably what we tend to do is judge ourselves for it instead of judging the story or the cultural message that we have, which is why I'm out here on every platform I can trying to change our cultural story, because that mismatch, that dissonance that happens between our lived experience and the story we're told about what grief should, air quotes, look like, causes us to sort of suffer unnecessarily. So we want to match those things up. And that's really what I try to do in my work, and what I tried to do in this book, I hope. Yeah.
You talk about grief is an inflammatory loss, complicated when infection takes hold. I love this. I think it was like a mentor of yours or someone shared that with you.
Yeah, it was and I'm blanking on their name right now. It was an article I read years ago, and I really loved that. Well, first of all, it was a metaphor, so who's not going to love a good metaphor?
I'm trying to find it because I actually... Catherine Shear?
Yeah. I think she was a researcher.
Psychiatrist and researcher.
Yeah. I just thought that was such an important thing. The grief happens to us, right? The event happens to us. The catastrophic injury, the divorce, the miscarriage, the stillbirth, the death, maybe the death of a dream, whatever it is. And then we have that wound. And our body goes into the self-protection mode, right? That's the inflammatory response, right? So, which, by the way, grief has a cognitive, emotional, physical, relational, and spiritual impact on our bodies. It's not just feeling sad. So our body and mind everything kind of goes into reaction to this. So I think of Mary Frances O'Connor's beautiful The Grieving Brain that explains how our brain actually shifts and changes in the wake of loss. Our body treats it like a stress response, right? Because we think of our body treats this as a threat. It's not a saber-toothed tiger attacking us back on the savannah in the days.
But it feels like a real psychological threat to our existence.
It's a psychological threat to our existence. So we have all kinds of physics. That's why if you're early in your early grief, I ended up having to have an emergency root canal 3 days after my husband died because my body was just like, and done, and I had other illnesses, right? So our body reacts, our brain function changes. Our emotions are also treated by our body, our psychology, our nervous system as a threat too, because we're having such outsized emotions that we haven't built muscles for navigating in the past. The secondary losses we experience when our relationships inevitably fizzle because people don't know how to show up for us. We have the existential or spiritual crisis. Why do bad things happen to good people, right? So it's not just the incidents, it's all these reactions or secondary losses, or as she named it, which I thought was great, this inflammatory response, which means that we need to be attending to our whole selves in grief. We need to be attending to our nutrition, to our sleep, to our physiological, our heart rate, and our well-being. We need to be attending to caring for the cognitive part of our brain because it's gone offline. We're mostly operating out of our animal brain, which is why we need to understand that maybe there's nothing wrong with us. You're not crazy because you keep forgetting things or you can't do tasks that you used to do. No, your brain is in a reactionary response to this loss, and it's going to come back online, I promise. But in the meantime, that would change the way we have bereavement and return to work policies. That would change the way people can show up for us. One of the best things I say to people when you say, well, how do you want to show up for somebody you love who experienced loss? Help them set everything on an automatic payment, timer, calendaring events. Like their brain is take over the tasks that seem like no effort, but that are really hard for a griever. That's just an example. So that's why I loved her metaphor and carried it into the book, because I think, again, what a difference we would make showing up for ourselves and showing up for other people if instead of having the narrative, grief is when someone dies and you're sad for a while and then eventually move on. What interventions would we apply to that version of the story versus the interventions we would apply to the story that someone who experiences a profound loss has a cognitive, emotional, physical, relational, spiritual impact. And we need to attend to that. Like, what a difference for the griever, what a difference for the helping community, what a difference for the corporate,
of what they could do, how they could help.
What they could do, how they would structure policies and practices, interventions, support. It's just a very different way of thinking about it. And that's why when I stumbled across that article, I was like, yes, I love a fellow metaphor giver. And I just thought it was really resonant to what we experienced. Somebody asked me, I was in a panel conversation last night, and somebody asked me, what's one thing you wish you could go back and tell, your very early grieving self? And I was like, only one thing? There's so many things I want to tell young Lisa. But I think that was sort of one of them, which was like, Lisa, let me tell you, this is going to have a cognitive, physical, emotional, spiritual, relational impact on you. So when you think about getting help and when you hear people offer help, recognize that you're not crazy for having all of that. That's just grief. And proceed with allowing people to help you in all of those domains and asking for help in all of those domains. That would have made a very different experience for me in early grief, especially because I was also not just being called to return to work 2 weeks after my husband died. I was now an only parent, which is insane. Insane. But then I was also an only parent to our 7-year-old daughter who was also grieving and having to parent her and navigate grief with her. So I think that more holistic way of understanding grief and understanding that it's a natural inflammatory, as that metaphor says, response is a real game changer, I hope, for all of us. And I use that throughout the book.
It makes me think of, I interviewed a woman, Nikki Mark, who lost her son. He died in his sleep. Do you know Nikki? She's in your...
I had her on my show.
She's wonderful. And she really talks about like attending to all these different pieces for herself to help her
Yes.
move through her grief.
Yeah. And it's not linear either. So it's like some days, your body's going to be screaming at you. So you're kind of playing whack-a-mole.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, eventually your goal is to sort of be a little more thoughtful and a little more planful and holistic. But honestly, in early grief, I just want to name, in case you're there, you're kind of playing a game of whack-a-mole a little. It's like the physical symptoms come up and now you're going to attend to that. And then there's the relational losses that you're having to attend to. And, you kind of are maybe in the beginning kind of just trying to keep it all a little bit less, frenetic. But if we can have the mindset that we're kind of doing that, if you need a checklist in grief, which I don't love, me, I do not love a checklist. I think part of our problem culturally is we like to move through stages and have checklists.
It seem but like when I just do all of these things, right?
Ta-da. And if you had to have a checklist, I would say have the checklist of those 5 domains, and weekly or daily, or when you check in with your therapist or you check in with your friend, look at those 5 domains and say, like, where am I getting support? Where am I struggling the most? How might I, when you think about that, what's the next best step in that start close in metaphor I offered earlier? You might look at that checklist of those 5 domains and say, which one is calling to me? Because maybe the suffering is the most in that particular domain. And so I'm going to just start with trying to find some ease.
Right.
In my physical well-being or in my cognitive functioning or whatever it is. Yeah.
So I want to end today where you start in the book, which is, again, this sort of metaphor or mantra that you live by, based on your love of scuba diving. Dive in and breathe deeply. So how can we apply that mantra to our lives, to grief, to everything that we encounter?
Yeah. And I love that you called it just dive in and breathe deep, because that was sort of the problem for me early on. And that's the invitation I have for all of us. The lesson I actually learned as a 12-year-old scuba diver, which I didn't really understand fully until I was there with my husband when he died, is there's actually a third piece, important and critical piece to the instruction. So dive in and breathe deep is easy to do when you're like choosing something, right? I'm going to like move across the country or take a new job or, audition for, Who's Got Talent, America's Got Talent or whatever, right? Yeah. Right. I'm just going to do it. It has a kind of carpe diem kind of, but there's a third instruction that's really important to scuba diving and is really important to life. And that's how I try to navigate. And that's buddy breathe when necessary. So when you learn to scuba dive, you never dive alone. You always dive with a partner, and you learn the skills of being able to share your oxygen in case something goes wrong with your tank. And so you can pass the regulator back and forth, and you're taking turns breathing, and you ascend slowly because you never want to shoot up to the surface when you're diving. And when I was reflecting after some time after Eric's death, I recognized the ways in which, especially as a helper, I'd been used to giving help in the world. Like that's how I thought about my role in the world. And one of the most important things we can do for ourselves in our grief, which does require other people being more grief literate so they know how to show up, is learn how to ask for and receive help. You always get on it.
The big thing.
It's the receive. And that's been a struggle for so many of us, because I think too, culturally, we've started to think about help as always having to be reciprocal in the interaction, right? I help you, you help me. And when you are laid low by loss, right, you don't have much to give. It's all about receiving. And so I think we have a problematic narrative, back to that theme, that it has to be in this reciprocal way. And so for me too, for sure. And even just this last season of my life when I got cancer, after a year of misdiagnosis and had to navigate this whole crazy journey that I've been on, I had to really talk myself in again. Even the last chapter I had to write for this book, between being diagnosed and turning it into my publisher, which was 10 days, by the way, was the chapter called Dive In, Breathe Deep, and Buddy Breathing When Necessary. And I was like, thank you, universe, for reminding me that I yet again need to practice this thing where I ask for and receive help.
Well, and here's, I think this to people, but I've started doing this, and I think it's a really easy place to start when you're not in it, because I think when you're in it, you don't want to make those choices. But to everybody who's listening, who's not in grief, who's just living their daily life, if you go out with a friend for coffee and they offer to pay for you, or you offer to pay for them, allow it.
Exactly.
Like something like that is so simple. But I noticed it in myself, and I'm not trying to dumb this down. I think it really like starts with something that simple where you're just like, thank you. You just say thank you, right?
Yeah.
And rather than
I think it's breaking the story of that reciprocalness.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And like not, I'll get you next time, or like, I've got this, or I'll get your dinner, or whatever it is. Like, just thank you, because sometimes it feels really good to give. And, and there's nothing that feels worse to a giver than someone who says, I don't want that from you.
Yeah. I want to add, I love that so much, Amy. And I want to add one thing that I learned in this particular season of receiving help, because once I got diagnosed, I committed to saying yes to every offer of help, even though it made my ego cringe and all the things, is that it actually creates more intimacy in the relationships that you have, not less. And every time you accept help without condition, you are teaching that other person that when it's their turn, when they're laid low by loss, which they will be, because welcome to the human existence, they can receive help too. Because people watch what we do a lot more than what we say. And that doesn't just go for our kids. So thinking about asking for and receiving help as an act of generosity and a gift actually to the giver has been a game changer for me. I'm not saying it's not a lesson I have to keep reminding myself on, but it's really profound. And I've really never worked with or met a griever who's really walked that walk, who hasn't lived and experienced that themselves too. Yeah. So dive in, breathe deep, and buddy breathe when necessary.
It's so great. What a perfect way to end. Get your buddies, people. Get your buddies. Whoever
get your dive buddies, get your grief buddies. Yeah.
Or life buddies, right? Like, I don't think it's just for grieving. I think it's for every stage of life, every phase of life. I feel like I have life buddies in career. I have life buddies in different stages of my kids' lives. I have life buddies all over the place.
By the way, that's how we were designed neurobiologically as humans, to be in tribe and community. That's what keeps us safe.
Oh my God, that's a whole
get your life buddies.
Podcast. I feel like
I know. Let's have a conversation another day on that. Yeah.
Oh my God, that I could go deep in. Lisa, if people are interested in your book, in your work, in your talks, in your everything, your podcast, where can they find you?
I think the two easiest places to keep track of me would be sign up for my newsletter. It's called the Not So Regular Newsletter, because grief isn't on a schedule, and neither is my newsletter. And it's just my name, lisakeefauver.com, and /newsletter. You'll sign up and you'll get information, tips, ideas, grief support, but also where to see me, etc. And then I try to be as social as I can be. So mostly I'm on Instagram the most, I would say. And it's Lisa Keefauver, MSW. That stands for Masters in Social Work. Lisa Keefauver, MSW on Instagram and LinkedIn and all your favorite social places. You can find me, and check out my show as well. While you're already on listening to this amazing show, you can check out Grief is a Sneaky Bitch on wherever you listen to this show.
Well, thanks, Lisa, so much. This was an awesome conversation, and I just love your energy and what you bring to this and your joy. I mean, you just exude joy in this topic that can be not so joyful.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Amy, so much for having me and for the work that you're doing and being a part of this community. It's great.
Like what you heard today and want to hear more? Wondering what comes next and what it all means? Head over to Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, or anywhere you get your podcasts and hit subscribe. Also, if you could take a minute to rate and review my podcast, I would really appreciate it. Stay tuned as we continue to explore life, death, and the space between.